Tonight, we've called our own Kudlow Debt Summit back again into action with the leadership of the Senate and the House. First, in the Senate, we welcome Idaho Republican Senator Mike Crapo, who's an original member of the Gang of Six. Also with us, we welcome Colorado Democratic Senator Mark Udall and Wisconsin Republican Senator and Tea Partier Ron Johnson. Thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate it very much. All right, let me go to Mr. Crapo. There is, by all accounts, a grand design deal that is cooking. $3 to $4 trillion, no tax increases. Mr. Crapo, I want to ask your comment on those reports right off the top.
Well, we've heard those rumors, and I know that the leadership of the House and Senate were called to the White House at about 5 o'clock tonight, so it's very possible that they are developing some truth behind them. We have to wait and see. I would say that one of the big questions to me, though, is what are the details of those supposedly $3 trillion worth of cuts? It's got to be real. And right now, from what I've seen, I'm a little dubious about whether they're going to really get to $3 trillion that can really be counted on.
Dubious, Mr. Udall. I want to ask you if you share that dubiousness, and I want to ask you your take on the general proposition from the reports. And again, I've been on the phone. You guys are more plugged in than I am, but we're talking about discretionary domestic cuts, defense cuts, entitlement cuts. Mr. Udall, I want to get your take on that.
Larry, I agree with Senator Crapo. These have to be real numbers. We've got to get savings, which ought to be a combination of revenues and cuts in the order of $4 to $5 trillion to really make a difference. Well, let me pay some homage to Senator Crapo and the Gang of Six. I'm a big supporter of what they're trying to do. This is an opportunity for America, as you let in with your show tonight, to get our fiscal house in order and put a growth agenda in place. You're exactly right. That's how we're going to get our economy back on track.
Senator Johnson, is it a growth agenda? Are you satisfied? I know you're a strong supporter of cut, cap, and the balanced budget amendment. That's not going to happen in the Senate. I'm also told that the Reid-Mitch McConnell idea is not going to happen. It's all being superseded by this grand design, which is sort of the group of, it's sort of the Gang of Six light, as I understand it. Mr. Johnson, what kind of mood are you in on this story?
Well, I'm confused because I don't know any of the details. I agree with both Mike and Mark. The devil will be in the details here. Now, obviously, if they finally put the tax increase aside, that would be good news. The dollar amount, again, we'll see whether that's going to be sufficient. Here's one of my problems, Larry, is nobody's talking about this, is the true cost of the health care law. Now, I've just been putting together some projections depending on how many employees will lose their coverage. There are a lot of surveys saying that 50% of employers are going to drop it immediately. That could add $2 to $4 trillion just in the next 10 years. That would wipe out any gains by this deal. So that's something we need to be talking about.
What about getting rid of the Class Act, Senator Johnson? That's the long-term entitlement for health insurance. That was in the Gang of Six. I don't know if it's in this deal or not, but what's your take on that? Is that progress?
Tell you everything I hear in the Senate, that's pretty much a consensus view to deep six that thing because it's simply not sustainable at all. Everybody recognizes that, so we can do that as a standalone piece of legislation. We should do that.
Mr. Crapo, I want to use the Gang of Six documents as the baseline for this grand design deal because what I gather, it's going to have a big influence. And I want to ask you to walk through. First of all, am I right? Is there $600 billion right off the top of spending cuts and spending caps for the discretionary accounts, not the entitlements, but the discretionary? And if so, how does that work?
Well, that's essentially true. There's 3 or 4 years of caps on the discretionary budget. There's also the implementation of a chained CPI government-wide, which impacts across the board in all government programs that depend on the CPI calculations. And there is the elimination of the Class Act and some other smaller pieces.
But are you raking over the coals to the defense budget also?
The way that the Gang of Six approached it is that in the discretionary budget, the defense cuts and the non-defense cuts, or what actually security cuts, because that includes Homeland Security. Security cuts and non-security cuts were supposed to be balanced. There are some non-security cuts that have already been taken, and so some of the initial looks have compared apples to oranges. But the balance in the Gang of Six plan was supposed to be about 50-50, which is the way it is in the discretionary budget.
Senator Udall, what's your take on the Medicare story? Paul Ryan wants to turn it into a voucher system. Medicare is included in the Gang of Six. We're going to get Mr. Crapo back to comment on that. Can you live with large-scale Medicare cuts? Can you live with cost of living adjustments downward? Can you live with the doctor's fix, which is real money? It's going to come out of doctors and hospitals. Can you live with the slowdown in the growth of Medicare, Mr. Udall?
Larry, that's quite a list. I can certainly live with the last three items you mentioned. I want to again mention that the Gang of Six has found a way to put a permanent doc fix in place as well as deal with the AMT. Those have both been very troubling elements in the way in which we pay for those particular functions. There is a way in which to slow down benefit increases that are tied to a true CPI indicator. And again, that makes a lot of sense. We're not going to cut benefits, but we'll tie them directly to the true cost of living here in the United States. So all in all, the Medicare cuts, which are going to be painful for all of us, are the right sized, I believe, and are pointed in the right direction.
Is your caucus going to support those cuts?
There's a broad-based support for the Gang of Six approach. As you know, many of us have signed a letter earlier this year and are on a new letter supporting the Gang of Six, but we have to better understand what's exactly in the final proposal. But look, everybody has to feel some pain here. We've got to distribute dissatisfaction equally, and as a Democrat, if we're going to support and strengthen Social Security and support and strengthen Medicare, we've got to make some of these changes now. It'll only get more difficult going forward.
You know, Senator Johnson, it almost sounds too good to be true. I'm going to use the number in the press, $3.7 trillion. I have no idea if that's the right number or not. I know there's a deal out there. I just know what the number is. How do you enforce this, Senator Johnson? Sometimes in life, as you know, when things are too good to be true, they're not true. And a lot of people like myself, and I guess you gentlemen, are going to ask, what's behind these big picture numbers? The numbers may assuage the S&P and the Moody's raters, but will they assuage taxpayers? Will they be real? Can you enforce them, Senator Johnson?
Well, I think you could enforce them if you actually pass the cut, cap, and balance bill. And I know we're going to be voting that tomorrow, and chances probably aren't real good the way it's been rushed. But Larry, I've always thought to solve our fiscal problem, it's a two-step process. And the first step is really establishing those hard spending caps, the controls, the fiscal discipline. And you can do that statutorily to limit the growth. And that's all we're talking about, is limiting the growth in spending. But I think long term, you actually do need a constitutional amendment to limit the size of government and produce a balanced budget. Unless you have that, I don't care what Congress does, what law they pass, Congress will figure out some way to weasel out from underneath it. We need the constitutional limitation and control. I just think that's a fact.
All right, gentlemen, please hang on for 1 minute. Bear with me. I want to bring in our ace reporter from Washington, John Harwood. Talks are happening right now at the White House. John Harwood, good evening. What can you tell us?
Larry, it's fascinating to hear your guests, the senators, reacting in real time to these fast-moving events. We've been doing that in Washington all day long. In particular, reacting to the news of a potential deal between Obama and Boehner. Now, I believe that will happen in the end, but Jay Carney, the White House press secretary, as well as spokesman for the Republican leaders on the Hill, took pains today to say that deal hasn't happened yet.
The breaking news report that you all have probably received is incorrect. There is no deal. We are not close to a deal. We are, obviously, the president is in discussions with all the leaders of Congress, as well as other members, and exploring the possibility of getting the biggest deal possible.
But now here are some of the signs of movement toward the deal that you were talking about earlier, Larry. One of them, of course, is the meeting that's going on right now between Democratic leaders and President Obama. Another is the fact that John Boehner is going to meet with the House Republican caucus tomorrow. And later tomorrow, the Senate is going to defeat the cut, cap, and balance plan that passed the House. Now, why is that a step forward? It's because members of the House and Senate, conservatives, need to have their first option explored before they can move to a fallback option, and that is precisely what Obama, Boehner, Pelosi, Reid, McConnell are exploring. I believe it will ultimately be based on the McConnell-Reid fallback plus this Gang of Six or Gang of Six light, as you mentioned. And I do think one more sign of movement, Larry, is that it is being described by some people, as you did in your lead-in, as a no tax increase deal. You even heard Grover Norquist today saying that letting the Bush tax cuts expire would not necessarily be a tax increase. As long as those marginal rates come down, I think you're going to see some conservatives on the Hill, Republicans being willing to accept revenue increases, and you need the revenue in order to get Democrats on board.
Well, you know, John, I've always argued if you reduce marginal tax rates, the base expands, the economy grows, and tax revenues go up. I regard that as a good thing.
Bingo.
John Harwood, thank you very much. Let me go back to my distinguished panel of senators, Senator Mike Crapo, Senator Mark Udall, and Senator Ron Johnson. Mr. Crapo, please help me out. I'm going to use your gang of six as a baseline. You didn't specify Social Security cuts, and you didn't specify Medicare, Medicaid cuts. What is underneath those statements in your 5 or 6 page document? Because that could be the basis of whether this new deal is real or not. What's in there, sir?
Well, again, you were looking at a summary document, but we did specify or create what I call the straitjacket. We created a mandate in the first vote that would force the Congress to put detailed reforms into place, and created an enforcement mechanism, to get back to your earlier question, that would force Congress to stay on this path. I agree with Ron that we need a balanced budget amendment, but we also need a strong procedural enforcement mechanism in the Senate.
But would that include the entitlements, this enforcement mechanism?
No, because the entitlements have to be under a different system. We do include a different procedural approach to try to enforce entitlements. But as you know, by the nature of what an entitlement is, it's a law that Congress has passed that doesn't get voted on again.
Yeah, but so it's really up to the Senate Finance Committee and the House Ways and Means Committee and the respective members of both bodies, right? I mean, nobody can rely on that, can they?
Well, first of all, when you say it's up to them, under the Gang of Six plan, doing it is not up to them. The first vote in the Gang of Six proposal will bind their hands and will force the level of cuts and reforms in those programs that are defined. If the committees don't come up with it, then there is an automatic across-the-board sequester of their budgets that forces those numbers.
Of the entitlements, too.
And that would happen with regard to the entitlement programs as well in the Gang of Six plan. And what would happen is that then if the committees did not do it, the mandated numbers of reform are still in law and in place, and senators would come together with alternative proposals in an expedited floor action to force a vote on proposals until one was adopted. And so it's not correct to say that this is just being left up to committees. We are creating a mandatory requirement in law that these savings be achieved, and then we are allowing the committees to fill the details in. If the committees don't fill the details in, then the Congress will fill the details in under a mandatory vote process.
Senator Udall, how would you recommend that we deal with the Social Security problem?
Larry, look, Social Security on paper is solvent, but if you really look at the creditor, the Treasury owes Social Security Administration $3 trillion. And we either, to make good on that obligation, have to print more money or tax Americans in additional ways. So the Gang of Six, backed up by the Bowles-Simpson Commission, came up with a way forward on Social Security where you would raise the employee tax rate, index it to inflation. You'd also look at raising the eligibility age while also protecting people who are in the vocations that demand a lot physically. You also would keep SSI whole 5 years into the future. It's an elegant solution, but it deals with the reality that faces us. On paper, Social Security is solvent, but if you really look behind the curtains, it's not. And if you care about Social Security, we need to take these steps today. So again, my hat's off to the Gang of Six for the way that they've constructed the process going forward.
Senator Johnson, I want to give you the last word on the tax reform piece, which the rumor mill says is not going to be part of this immediate package, but will be done down the road, maybe towards the end of the year. I argue that lower marginal tax rates, the top rates could come down to 25% for individuals and businesses. The AMT will be gone. Those are good things, and they might grow the economy and produce more revenues. Senator Johnson, others, conservatives, disagree with me, and they're worried about the revenue piece. Are you? Should we be worried there's a big fat tax hike down the road that would undermine the economy?
Yeah, you should always be worried about that, particularly with Congress here. But, again, I think that's another one of these things that's kind of a growing consensus here in Congress that we do need to just dramatically reform our tax code. I mean, 70,000 pages, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of compliance costs. Plus, it makes us very uncompetitive with a very high corporate tax rate, all the regulations surrounding that as well. So I really do think that structural tax reform is possible. Is that possible to do this debt ceiling vote? I don't think so. That's going to take some time, some real thought. So we do need to push that down the road a bit.
So this is like a Reagan solution. This is lower spending and lower tax rates. I mean, I look at this as a Reagan solution.
Yeah, I mean, again, I would be for that as long as we're not increasing marginal tax rates. We got to lower marginal tax rates. That is really what drives economic activity. And let's face it, growth is the #1 component to the solution here. We've got to grow our economy.
Gentlemen, thank you very, very much, Senators Udall, Crapo, and Johnson. I appreciate your time.